All right, let's get started. Seems like we've got a good number of people here. Um, so, thank you all for joining us on this Lunch and Learn today. My name's Anna Michaels, and I'm the project manager at Family Resource Center Association. And we are so lucky to have Matt Bennett here to give us to do a webinar on trauma-informed care. And yeah, we are looking forward to a good hour of some information on how we can use this trauma-informed care and other ways in implementing into our work with families at Family Resource Centers. So, Matt, if you want to get started. Oh, and then
Great.
also, sorry, just to also say, I'm going to keep an eye out on questions that you might have. You can chat those into the box, and just since there's going to be a lot of people on here, I think the best way will be for just chat your questions in, and then towards the end we can ask Matt those questions. There might be also opportunity if you have audio that I can unmute you if you have more detailed question that you want to ask in person. So with that, we'll get started.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I'm really thrilled to be here today to have an hour to really share with you my passion for the work of trauma informed care. I have some friends that think I'm a little crazy because I get very excited to talk about one of the most depressing topics you could spend your lunch break talking about, which is trauma and everything that causes people trauma in their life, whether that's being abused by another human being or hurt by another human being or a group or a victim of a natural disaster or terrible accident, something like that. Really, some of the most devastating things we face cause that trauma. And I always like to remind them that my passion isn't for trauma, my passion's in understanding trauma so we can really help people, families, and communities heal. And I really am honored, and I want to thank the folks at the Family Resource Center Association for giving me this small chunk of time. And I know what is probably a busy day for everybody on board. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about myself because I want to talk about more my research and passion for this topic. But if you are interested in learning more, as I take you through a really quick sprint through some deep water in the time we have together the day, just a few resources to throw out there. I do try to get weekly content out there to people to continue their learning. Both through a blog that I've been doing now for, I believe I'm at about the 5-year point, and the Trauma Informed Lens podcast, which I do with my good friend, Dr. Jerry Yeager and Kurt Moyer as well. And hopefully both of those would both be educational and also entertaining for you as well. And if you even want more of me after our hour together, I've written a couple books. The main one is Connecting Paradigms. It talks about trauma and helping people make changes. And then I did a follow-up book called Talking About Trauma and Change, which you can find on Amazon and pretty much anywhere else you can buy books. So that's just if you want more information, and I'll throw this up at the end as well too, so you have that information. So let's dive into this. And I want to start about what is trauma, because one of the things I see, and I'm really happy to see this happening, is so many people are using this word now. And not just people in the field of psychology or social work, but we also just see the general public using trauma a lot. I can't believe where this material has taken me personally. I'm really excited right now because I actually get on a plane to talk about my passion in Honolulu next week, which I'm really excited about. I always love it when I can present at an island. But you know, I've been training libraries, working with a local police department here in the Denver metro area. More and more schools are looking at this, and all areas of the helping profession. So, but we also have to understand what is trauma, and our understanding of trauma has developed pretty significantly over the past few years as our research and technology gets better. So I've started to use some language to help sort of break down the different types of trauma, and we could really break these down into subcategories. But for limited time, I want to talk about big T and small t trauma. Big T trauma is something probably historically as we thought about as a traumatic event. This is something that happens that basically overwhelms our ability or our nervous system's ability or capacity to maintain our regulation. In other words, the stress is so great from this event that it overwhelms our coping systems and really puts us in a survival mode. Now, this survival mode for some people might just last a few days. For other people, unfortunately, it can last a lifetime. I differentiate because really trauma is an intense type of stress. How I differentiate is I like to say, especially when we talk about a big T trauma event, it knocks us on our butt, it knocks us down, and we need someone's help to get back up. The big trauma is not something we can just kind of walk off on our own, but it overwhelms us to the extent is that we need others' help to support to recover from it. Otherwise, it's just a stressful event. If you can go for a run, if you can take a 3-day weekend, that's stress, whereas trauma really keeps us down for a while. Now, a lot of people need mental health support to get over the trauma. Others might just need support of family or friends. So big T trauma, again, is those events that overwhelm us. We also know, and I just want to put out there that trauma is a very individualized experience. You can have 4 people in a car that has a severe car wreck. One person might, even though they may have to go to the emergency room the next day, psychologically at least, they're fine. They can get back in the car. They can drive by that spot, no problems. 2 people might be a little nervous to get back in a car, might avoid that spot where the accident happened, might struggle to get on the interstate if it happened on a highway. And a 4th person might be paralyzed by the event, might need weeks off work, might need intensive therapy to overcome the experience. So a highly individualized experience no matter what. Also, we know that children, because of their neurobiology, are more likely to be traumatized by an event. But again, you could have 2 children experiencing something very similar. One might be traumatized by it, one might just be stressed out about it. So that's the tricky thing about trauma is it might really impact one person for the rest of their life. Another person might be okay. And there's so many factors that go into the why behind that. But I just wanted to make sure we all understand that it is a very personalized experience. Another part of trauma that I've really started talking about more and more detail as time and research develops is what I like to call and others call small T trauma. And small T trauma is really just living under high stress situations with the threat of a big T traumatic event occurring at any time. This helps explain the neurobiology or the impact on the brain that we see from things like poverty, homelessness, living in war zones where there may not be a big T trauma happening, and sometimes it may never happen, but just living under that intense level of stress with the threat of trauma always a possibility. What we know is our body and our biology continues to release cortisol and other stress hormones like cytokines and other things that result in the traumatic damage done by a big T traumatic event as well. So this is another thing where I think it helps us put poverty, extreme poverty, especially homelessness or housing instability, food instability, into those traumatic event categories where we didn't really have great language to talk about that until recent years. The final thing, and what we're going to talk about most with our limited time together today, is something called complex trauma. And complex trauma is really, I like to think about it as it's repeated traumatic events over time. I think, and unfortunately, knowing my audience here, this won't be an unfamiliar situation for most of you. But let's say we have a family where there's child abuse and domestic violence going on. A lot of times, let's say Monday, dad gets drunk, unfortunately comes home, starts to become verbally abusive, and then that escalates into physical abuse. Well, there's that big T traumatic event. It happens at a specific time and date. Mom and the child are worried about each other's safety and their own ability to survive the event. But then think about what happens to both the mom and kid that next morning? What's the first thought that they have in their head? What's that kid thinking about all day at school? Is he thinking about his spelling test or his math assignment? Probably not. He's probably worried all day about, is dad going to get drunk and come home again and be abusive? And so when we see family systems struggling with violence or poverty, mental illness, addiction, a lot of times what that creates is this big T, small t combination. And so this complex trauma, when we talk about people that end up, the vast majority of people in our homeless shelters, in our prison systems, in our addiction facilities, it's not only one bad thing happened to them along the line, or they just randomly picked up a bad habit. So often it's this combination of big T and small t traumas over a period of life. The good thing about trauma that I just want to really reinforce before we move on is we can cure trauma. There are tremendous best practices developing in the fields of psychology and other related fields, even like there's trauma-informed yoga and Tai Chi, all these really cool interventions coming out. So from here on out, when I say this is the impact of trauma, what I'm really saying is this is the impact of trauma that hasn't been given the right mix of resources and support to heal. To me, the tragedy and why I value any opportunity to speak to a group of leaders like yourself is that too often the people, again, that end up, I do a lot of work in the adult systems as well with homelessness, addiction, and criminal justice, is that the people that end up living on the street or struggling with addiction, the vast majority of those folks just did not get the help that they need. If we get the help that we need, we know we can transform trauma and the pain and suffering into something beautiful called post-traumatic growth, where we actually build up resiliency, wisdom, and strength from overcoming that experience. And if life throws another difficult thing or trauma at us, we have that experience and that strength to actually bring to that new challenge and situation. So there is so much hope here. The heartache and the devastation is when the right resources don't get to the family, the child, or the adult. And too often, as we'll see now with the ACE study, there's real hardcore consequences if that doesn't happen. I just like to throw this number out because if I put 124 billion there, I think the zeros drive this home. Because now that we see the long-term impact of trauma, we know that it's costing in the United States $124 billion annually. And when we look at the symptoms of trauma, I think that will become very obvious why we see such a high number here. Before we do this, I wanna focus in on what's called the adverse childhood experience study, and I'm sure some of the folks listening to me now you've heard of this before. If you haven't, I always love the opportunity to introduce this because this is what around 2004 I was exposed to this study. I saw it and it changed my life, to be honest with you. Not only my career, but from that moment on, even as a therapist in 2004, with 3 years of master's study and undergraduate in human services, so basically 7 years of studying human psychology. When I was working, I saw this when I was in child welfare, but I also had worked in juvenile justice as well. I could not answer you the question of why these kids are struggling. Why do these kids keep making terrible choices? Why do their parents continue to make terrible choices? I really loved the work that I did, and I really found good in the people that I was working with, even though they were struggling with hard things. But if you would have asked me why do they keep struggling, I don't know if I would have had a really good answer for you. I probably, since I had 3 years of grad school, could make something really good sounding come out of my mouth. But I don't think deep down I really understood that. And then I got the ACE study and things started to make sense. So if you're not familiar with the ACE study, just a really brief idea of where this came from. It was done, Kaiser Permanente was running in San Diego, California, was running obesity studies. And they were really having a great success with people in these studies losing weight. But at a certain point, people started to drop out of the study. And because the study was being done by Kaiser, unlike most of my experiences where sometimes you lose people and you don't know how to find them, Kaiser, all they had to do was go to their electronic medical records and look up addresses and phone numbers. And the medical providers would contact the women. It was a primary study focused on women. They contact the women in the study and say, hey, what's going on? I thought we were doing good. And over, what they heard was, when I lost a certain amount of weight, men started to pay attention to me again, and it brought back memories of past sexual abuse. And all of a sudden, I give so many, both the CDC, or the Centers for Disease Control, those providers at Kaiser, so much credit, because they said something's going on here. So they created the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. And so they basically ran this with 17,000 people who had Kaiser in San Diego, California. And I say had Kaiser because these people were not representative of the populations I normally work with. I think about 75% had some college experience. The vast majority of people had insurance through their employers. So we have a middle to upper class, primarily subsection of San Diego. And they found some interesting things. One they found is that the number and intensity of adverse childhood experiences, they didn't sort of know the second level of the neurodevelopment. We will get to that here in a moment. But what they found was that these people had higher rates of these health risk behaviors, such as smoking, drug use, risky sexual behavior, other things, eating habits that lead to things like diabetes, behaviors that lead to things like cancer and addiction, and so on and so forth. So they assumed that this was become some kind of social, emotional, and cognitive impairment led to these health risk behaviors that then resulted to a higher, and this was very correlated because of the data and the health records Kaiser had, there was a higher rate of disease, disability, and social problems with this group. And we'll look at that in more detail here in a second. To me, the most powerful finding of really the history of trauma research is what's at the top of that pyramid. They found, and other studies have really backed this up since, is that people with complex trauma, their life expectancy is only 60 years compared to people without trauma or have resolved their trauma and healed from it, especially if that healing happened quickly after the traumatic event. The life expectancy is 80 years. And so if you think about the importance of trauma and this understanding of this literature, this science, this research, is that something's going to happen to a child in your community tonight. And if you're from community size, like I'm from the Denver metro area, this is going to happen hundreds, if not thousands of times in my community tonight and in your community tonight. Something's going to happen to a child, no fault of that child. I don't think we'd blame a child for being abused or blame a child being a part of a family that might be struggling with addiction or mental health issues, or have a parent incarcerated, or those horrible disruptive things to the family. But something's going to happen to a child that if we don't get that child the treatment that they need, and we don't realistically get the family the help that they need, that child could lose 20 years off their life. Think if that was a virus that was happening to children in our community and the response that we would have to that. I really advocate is we need a similar response to make sure we identify these kids and get the kids and their families the help that they need. And so this pyramid really helped me understand the importance of this, and also I think really puts forth the challenge in of the trauma-informed paradigm shift. These are some, and I say some because I've got slides and slides and slides on this stuff, and it just gets really depressing over time, of some of the results of trauma. I like to call these trauma symptoms. We see on one hand, there's a huge misdiagnosis of mental illness. And I think about the kids I work with come in with ADHD diagnosis or conduct disorder or histrionic borderline personality disorder. And this medical model of psychology is really detrimental in many ways, because if we just focus on the symptoms, that will direct us to medicate those symptoms in a certain way. What we now know, if we look at the individual developmentally, is that these symptoms are a result not of some brain dysfunction that we should call ADHD, though that does exist in population. So it's not like there's no ADHD out there, but so many of the kids were diagnosing and medicating for ADHD or personality disorders, mood disorders. Unfortunately, that's a result of their trauma. So if we just medicate the symptoms, we're not really we're denying that person a cure. So we have to start to look developmentally. And then there's just a whole list here of things that you go through that for children make it really difficult to thrive in school situations. We see that kids with that complex trauma are much more likely to fail grades, end up in special education, struggle socially as well. Also, eventually, this can lead to social economic problems when the person is old enough to get in the workforce, problems with romantic relationships, friendships, so on and so forth. So I like to sum up all this research and not to get too depressed about the details here, because I sum it up in this way. Is all the problems that all the people you work with or all the problems people are having in your community a result of trauma? Absolutely not. If we say everything's trauma, we're going to miss some big things we shouldn't be missing. If you would come to me and say, Matt, is the vast majority of problems that the vast majority of people in my community or in my services experiencing due or related some way to their past trauma history, we have the research where I feel really confident to say absolutely yes to that. At least we need to rule the trauma out because we see the prevalence that it has. One of the big studies with the adverse childhood experience or ACE study was that within that population, again, a mostly upper middle class San Diego, California, that about just under 2/3 of people had experienced childhood trauma in their life. So I like to think about it this way. If you go to a high school graduation, research shows us, and if you go to a school that from an impoverished area, it's probably going to be higher than one that has more socioeconomic research, though. Again, if you think about upper and middle class San Diego, that's where this data is coming from, is that basically about 2/3 of the kids walking across the stage graduating from high school has had at least one traumatic experience in their life. This is not by any means a small minority population within our communities. In fact, again, by the time people graduate from high school, we know the vast majority of them will have had experienced a traumatic experience. So again, it may not be that complex trauma, but trauma touches more people's lives, unfortunately, than doesn't. So it just gives us, when I work with school districts, I really reinforces this is not a small minority of kids walking through the doors every day. In fact, this is the vast majority. So just some really important data there to look at and talk about. And then there's the science. One of the things that really struck me, and I was sort of lucky to get the ACE study in 2004 when we started to have functional MRIs come on board, and we could actually really see the brains of individuals who've experienced trauma. And one of the things that really struck me, and it struck me in a way that changed the entire projection of my career, is that the kids I was working with, the families I was working with, because I knew with my folks that they were all coming from traumatic situations, their brains were different. And I'm not sure why that struck me so powerfully, but there's a biological injury of trauma. And so when we see the behavioral problems folks have, the social problems, the problems in school and in employment, how we can look at that is there's a biological injury that creates those problems. And I really advocate for us to start thinking of those symptoms as sort of, if somebody broke their leg and they limped, we probably wouldn't call that person lazy. We wouldn't call that person bad. We wouldn't call that person unmotivated. We wouldn't blame them for a symptom of their biological injury. And we need to start thinking about neurobiology as an organ like we do the bones of our body and other organs of our body as well. Before we get into the nerdy brain science, though, I want to talk about how this brain develops over time. And this is where the concepts of epigenetics and homeostasis hold some really great lessons for us. Homeostasis basically represents that we create a neurobiology or brain that allows us to best thrive or survive in our environment. In other words, we're going to create a brain that really allows us to achieve success or at least survive what we're facing on a daily basis. And to understand this, we have to go into this concept of epigenetics, which just blew my mind when I saw it, but started to make a whole bunch of sense, both from the behaviors I was seeing, but also from how I needed to really think about helping people live the lives that I aspire to, and hopefully they aspire to for themselves as well. And back in the dark ages, when I was in my sophomore biology class, we learned about DNA. And we learned basically of what we now call chromosomal DNA, which is all we thought DNA was. And chromosomal DNA is, what we learned about hair color, eye color, skin color, whether you're prone to be tall, short, whatever that might be, those physical characteristics. And that we've known for a while accounts for about 3% of our total DNA. And I find this a little funny in hindsight, is we called the rest of the 97% of our DNA junk. We called it junk DNA. When we don't understand something, we give it a pretty negative terminology. So we called this junk DNA. Well, as our science got better, what we realized, we now call this non-coded DNA. And this DNA reacts differently to environmental situations. And I always like to put relationships in there as well, because that to me, especially with children, and the attachment relationships are so important. Relationships are such a powerful piece of our environment. But so with this part of our DNA, which accounts for the much more of our DNA than the chromosomal DNA, I like to think about the fuse box at your house or apartment. As you know, you can flip those switches on and off. So if an environmental demand to survive or thrive in the face of that demand requires us to develop a certain trait, what happens is some of our non-coded DNA will turn itself on, others will turn itself off. And that combination releases a protein that's called RNA. And to really skim over a lot of complex science, what the RNA does is it directs our brain to structure and function in certain ways. And that's the critical aspect of this. So even at the microscopic, the DNA level of our biology, we are always adapting to our environment. So the tragedy of this, even though this is a positive thing for the most part, because we want to be set up to succeed in our environment, if a child's raised in an abusive relationship, if a family has to survive, whether it's chronic or just temporary homelessness from time to time, if a child grows up, or even a spouse has to survive, a family member with an extreme addiction or an abusive partner or parent, our brain will also structure to survive that. I worked early on in my career with teenagers coming basically out of a gang war from inner city metropolitan area that was one of the highest murder rates in the United States at the time. And what amazed me is that these kids weren't just surviving this war zone. And survival, you have to kind of put in quotes here, but some of these kids, through selling drugs and other criminal activities, were making significant amounts of money. Now, again, that's not what we would aspire for these kids to succeed in, but they took that situation. Born in the war zone, most of my kids came from homes that were ravaged by addiction themselves, and they were able, even at age 15, 16 years old, to, if I'm honest, make more money a year than I was as a young aspiring therapist. So we'll always adapt to these situations, and this adaptation really determines our academic potential later on in life, economic potential, and as we looked at with all those symptoms, really help us maintain a quality of life the best we can. Again, so if we're raised in healthy environments with healthy relationships, the RNA that we need to really thrive is released, and our brains are really structured as we enter the school ages to really thrive in those environments. Unfortunately, if we're having to survive abuse, addiction, mental illness, whatever is in the home, we're adjusted to survive that at the expense of sometimes being able to really thrive in other environments. So this all leads to this thing called the brain. And this is where it really, and I'm going to do the brain a huge disservice here because of our limited time and the complexity of the brain. I'm gonna give you a brief understanding of this, hopefully to build on some of maybe stuff that you've already heard. So please forgive me for not going into the complexity. We could talk literally for about 3 days just about the amygdala, and I will talk about that in a matter of seconds. So I will do it some disservice, and I'll ask your forgiveness for that. But I really want to look at what is the biological injury that trauma causes. And so right now, hopefully, you're sitting probably in front of a screen, you're seeing the slide, you're hearing my voice. So those two types of stimulus come in right to the center of the brain, to something called the thalamus. And the thalamus, for our model here, is sort of the relay station of the brain. And it's really constantly looking out for, am I safe or is there danger in my environment? Am I safe or is there danger in my environment? So we've survived as a human species. Some of us can, and this is so fortunate, can go through a whole day without ever feeling in danger. That was not the human experience for most of our existence. We always had to be alert of a predator behind a bush or another tribe invading. So there's this thalamus there that's always keeping us safe. And so hopefully right now you don't feel like there's any threats in your environment. You feel relatively safe. Maybe you're enjoying a nice sandwich or something for lunch. So what happens if you feel safe? Your thalamus kicks the stimulus up through what's the B labeled road here. I like to call it the high long road. And it kicks the stimulus, or what I'm trying to teach you about the brain, it throws up into your cortex. And what the cortex does a million different things, but for our purposes here, the cortex holds a lot of memories of past things. So for example, I didn't say the brain is the organ inside your head. So if you learn somewhere along the line that, yeah, the brain is that thing of kind of jello-y thing in your head, I don't need to tell you that. Your cortex has that memory. So it takes the stimulus coming in, or the words that I'm saying, and it compares it to what you already know about the brain. And it does this automatically, obviously. And then it kicks it to this beautiful part right in the front of our brain called our prefrontal cortex. And this really, we kind of label this the executive center of the brain, the conductor of the orchestra of the brain. There's a lot of good analogies to think about the prefrontal cortex. This is what we utilize to problem solve, to think into the future, to maybe as I talk about trauma, you're thinking about a family you're working with, so you're applying that information. That's a prefrontal cortex functioning. It's that really high level of thinking that as human beings, we're fortunate to have a really robust prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex also plays a critical role with our next stop on this high long road journey, which is the amygdala. The prefrontal cortex and the amygdala relate in a couple different ways, but the amygdala is the stress-based part of our brain. So we'll talk about what happens when danger enters the environment here in a second, but also we can accumulate stress and the stress hormone cortisol throughout the day. So if you feel, and maybe you've had this experience in the last week or so, but let's say you're in a meeting, you're just starting to get frustrated. You're starting to get a little angry, but you're like, I'm in a professional role. I need to take a deep breath and not blow up, not say the thing that's on the tip of my tongue. That's your prefrontal cortex regulating your amygdala. So the stronger the prefrontal cortex, the more we can regulate our emotional states. So on this high long road, though, if you're emotionally regulated, the amygdala's role at this point of our journey on the B road or high long road is it provides the emotional context or richness to what's being said. So let's say you're thinking about trauma, how it applies to this family. And let's say maybe the mom of that family left you 36 new voicemail messages last night. Well, maybe your amygdala is kicking in a little bit of frustration there. Maybe you're worried because unless you find some resource, that family might get evicted from their apartment. Well, then the amygdala will kick in worry at that point. So the amygdala adds the emotional context on the high road. And then the final stop is that worm-looking thing called the hippocampus right there. The hippocampus on the high long road creates memories for us, creates long-term memories. So if I tell you anything, and hopefully at least get one thing out of our hour together, that you think, man, it would be great if I remembered this tomorrow. Obviously, this is all unconscious. What your hippocampus does is it takes the important things you learn throughout the day, and if they're critical enough, will then create long-term memories in the cortex for later recall and use. So that's the high long road. There's also that A road, or short low road, as I like to call it. And this is what happens. Let's just say, and hopefully this doesn't happen as I'm talking, but a car crashes through your facility and all of a sudden there's a bumper coming right at you. Well, now you no longer care about me. I'm the last thing on your mind. Me ranting about the brain and trauma, you care nothing about me. Basically what it does is the thalamus shuts off this high long road because it's very energy intensive to keep that thing going. It shoots it down the amygdala, and you see how close the amygdala is to the thalamus. And that's design is on purpose, because immediately the amygdala says, holy bleep, it activates something called the HPA axis, or hypothalamus pituitary adrenal glands, floods our body with cortisol and adrenaline, and basically the energy that was going into our prefrontal cortex on that high long road goes into your legs so you can run away. That's what we call the flight response. If you can't run away for something, you may fight back against it. That's what we call the fight response. Usually our first response is to run away. If we can't run away, then we usually fight back. So the other thing about the short low road is that, let's say that car crashed through your facility, it misses you by a few inches, you obviously run away, you get outside and you realize, okay, this was just one car, something weird happened here, but I'm okay. So what the hippocampus does on this low road is it basically tells the amygdala, hey, you did your job. We can go back to processing this now. We can go back up. We no longer need to run away. There's nothing here for us to attack. So let's start to think about what just happened and figured this out, and maybe call the insurance company, and whatever you do when a car rams through your facility. And so the hippocampus helps calm the amygdala once it gets triggered on that low road. So now let's look at what trauma does to this system. A few things. So if we follow it up to that B road, or the high long road, in the cortex, if we, again, this is unresolved trauma, what we know is those memories constructed during the traumatic event. And this is probably a whole training in and of itself, but we know trauma is so stressful that we don't always form coherent memories during a traumatic event. So these are a little different than you thinking about your kind of last birthday party. You can probably think about, okay, where was I on my last birthday, or what did I do over the holidays last year? Those are what we call explicit memories, is we can just recall them and we have pretty good recall of them. Traumatic memories are often jumbled, not integrated in. So this gets tricky, because I may be regulated on that high long road, but if something in the environment reminds me of my traumatic experience, what happens is I trigger and I bring all the emotions associated with that traumatic event into the present situation. So a lot of these extreme behaviors that for a lot of folks I worked even got them so extreme that it may have lended up to involvement with the police and other systems, is a result of not someone waking up in the morning and say, you know, I'm going to blow up in the waiting room today. I'm going to kick my teacher or my case manager. I'm going to smack my physician. You know, I'm going to call a police officer a really bad name. What happens most of the time is something reminds them of their traumatic situation. And we can't predict what this is for everybody. It may be a certain smell. Working with both female and male teenagers early on in my career, if a female client of mine was abused by their father or uncle or a male figure, I might be a source of re-traumatization for them. A certain word, a song, those sort of things can all trigger that experience. And so you can think about, with that unresolved trauma, any sort of brain processing is somewhat of a minefield of traumatic memories. Then the prefrontal cortex, this is one of the biggest findings. It starts to really help a lot make sense, as we see with, again, that complex trauma without the healing experience. Prefrontal cortex is actually smaller in size. So the physical part of the brain that children need to achieve in school and that adults need to achieve in our current society is actually physically smaller in size. Not only does that really limit executive functioning, but it also highly limits the prefrontal cortex ability to regulate the amygdala or the emotional regulation in our body. And to make matters worse on this, the amygdala is actually physically larger in size. So what this is telling us, how this manifests itself is, I'm going to see a lot more things as threats, including probably, unfortunately, because so many of our people have been abused by other people, I'm going to start to maybe see people in power, just men or women as potential threats as well. So again, we see a smaller prefrontal cortex, a larger amygdala. So we're going to see more extreme emotions. We're going to have less ability to regulate those emotions and kind of hold our stuff together and not say the thing we know we shouldn't say. The final piece here in our quick skim over the brain is damage to the hippocampus as well, which is actually also smaller in size. And why that matters is, again, with a larger amygdala, I'm going to get triggered, I'm going to get angry more, I'm going to more likely activate, and we see this in brain scans, the connections between the thalamus and amygdala are actually stronger, more well developed with trauma. Once I get triggered, the hippocampus doesn't have the ability to say, okay, it's safe now, you can go back up to the high long road. And if you've ever worked with anybody where they get a little upset and they just start to seem to spiral, and it's not that big of a deal, but you just kind of feel like they can't stop themselves, what we're seeing is that's really a manifestation of that hippocampus not having the power it really needs to get that amygdala back calm and get the prefrontal cortex back online. So again, I like to think about this biological injury because we're not going to blame the individual for having experienced the trauma. This is like somebody, again, a biological injury of a broken leg. We're going to adjust our expectations and probably change the environment for that person's biological injury. Unfortunately, in most situations, schools aren't prepared for this biological injury. So this brain becomes the brain of the quote unquote, and I'm making air quotes, I promise, when I say this word, it becomes the bad kid. Hate the terminology, but I'm also married to a first grade teacher. So, and I do a lot of work with schools and have been in schools. You know, it's the kid that you're always talking about, the behavioral problem. Those becomes that kid. This kid, if the help's not given, unfortunately, then I meet this kid when I walk into a homeless shelter or prison. We see a much higher rate of addiction with trauma as well. And so there's a biological injury here that has a lot of symptoms coming out from it. So when we look at trauma-informed care, I want to spend the rest of our time just looking over it. We can go back to the ACE pyramid because this is the real shift. And for me, this isn't just a shift of my thinking, but also how I structure programming, how I structure interventions, and at this point in my life too, how I really think about my work as an advocate around social justice for folks that have been hurt in their life. One is we're stuck sort of up on the top of this pyramid still in most of our communities, most of our schools, even most of our mental health is still constructed by what did you do? Again, these symptoms of the behavior, the limp of the broken leg, that limp's replaced by addiction, maybe violence, repeating family patterns of behaviors. And so when we get stuck on the behaviors, we try to fix the behaviors. Well, just like I mentioned with the ADHD, if we don't look at what's really causing the behaviors, we may address something, but I don't know if you've ever felt like this, but as long as we focus on symptoms, oftentimes what happens is as soon as we help someone maybe lessen one symptom, another one pops up. I really started to feel like my job was like a game of whack-a-mole. If you're old enough to remember whack-a-mole, where there was always another mole to pop up that you had to bash with that mallet. The other thing is what's wrong with you, and we judge people. We put labels on people, such as homeless person, addict. We have all these labels to put on. There's something that you're choosing to do. What is wrong with you? And again, if we look at the research, we build empathy, and the question we really need to ask is what happened to you. Because if we can identify the kids struggling in school, the parents struggling to build a secure attachment, the person struggling with a drug and alcohol addiction, we know that the vast majority of those folks are carrying around unresolved trauma and that biological brain that resulted from it. So I like to say, hey, if you see a symptom like somebody struggling with housing stability, we can focus on that. But we also ask the question is, okay, is some of this person's struggle because of unresolved trauma in their past? And the challenge to not only us as providers of family resource centers around our great state, but really for everybody in our community is how do we get those people the help that they need? So to me, this is really the paradigm shift of not just focusing on behaviors, not just focusing on there's something wrong with you. Why is this person unmotivated? Why is this person lazy? Those sort of easy conclusions that too many people, both in our field, policymakers, community members jump through, but realizing so much of this is due to unresolved trauma. A few things you can do, and again, this is sort of the brief outline, but if you want to become a trauma-informed family resource center, it's not rocket science. It's a little bit of brain science, but hopefully at least simple brain science. And when people ask me, hey, we want to become trauma-informed, the first thing, the informed piece of this is learning. What is trauma? How's trauma impacting our patient or client or family populations? Really looking at this and understanding the science behind this, and probably honestly a lot better than I can ever do with only 60 minutes to try to throw as much at you as possible. The other things that I love to put on people's radar too is one of the things trauma is teaching us is we've got to focus on self-care. There's terminology coming in, vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, where we know that the work of helping traumatized populations can traumatize a caring, empathetic helper professional as well. So you can't be trauma informed if you're burned out and traumatized yourself. And I always like to put leadership on there as well, because you can pick up leadership books. I was so interested in leadership at one point in my life, I went back and got a master's of business administration in healthcare. But every book I picked up talked about how to lead at Walmart or how to lead at Google. And those were good books, but I didn't find a book of how do you lead and how do you manage and keep somebody healthy who has to hear day in and day out about kids getting abused, or racism, or all these things that come into our offices every day. So those are the three core areas of learning. And then you implement this knowledge. Part of this is looking at your approaches and interventions. Do you have trauma-specific treatment like an EMDR, brain spotting? There's a lot of amazing trauma-informed treatment best practices coming out there. How can your approaches, your procedures, get better in line with the science? And some of this is our own policies as well. I've worked with organizations that, hey, we don't have a bereavement policy. Well, you know, if you're making people take their vacation time off to go to funerals, is that trauma informed? And you know, that question, is this trauma informed, usually leads you to the right answers. The other thing that I can't divorce from trauma-informed care is to advocate for change. I no longer say that we don't have the money is not a good excuse. It may be the reality for that moment, but what are you going to do to get the money tomorrow? I think too often in our field, we hit these walls and we sort of try to do the best we can within what boundaries we're given. And I've been in that situation. But I really challenge people in your communities. Can you talk to a school board member? Can you talk to a principal at a school? Can you talk to, maybe you can't get to Bennett's office or in Hickenlooper's office, but could you go to your police chief in your local community? Who can you talk to? Even if you just talk about to a spouse or a partner or a friend, whatever it is, we need to advocate, because the more people that understand this, the more likely we will stop hurting people that are traumatized and re-traumatizing them and get them the help they need. and then repeat, because by the time you get all these done, we'll have new brain science out there, and hopefully I can do another webinar with you all and tell you what we found out, the next chapter of the amygdala or the prefrontal cortex. So again, it's a simple roadmap, but I think it's a critical one going forward. And again, if there's any way I can help you out, I love being a resource. I love talking to people from Colorado. I've done a ton of work around the state and have just really appreciated learning and connecting with the Family Resource Center Association. Just kind of really cool to look at the work you're all doing kind of from that meta level, as I've worked with resource centers throughout my career. So it's a huge honor. I know I'm talking to a lot of leaders in their communities when I talk to this group. And like I said, if I can help you in any way get to that goal of creating trauma-informed organizations, interventions, and if you really want to be ambitious communities, hopefully I can be a useful resource for you. So I actually made it through this rant in 51 minutes, which does leave us a few times for questions. If you have them, please feel free to type them in, or I think you can unmute yourself, and Anna might be able to facilitate that well. So let me know if you have any additional thoughts.
Yeah, so feel free to chat into the box if you have a question, or you can press the hand raising button on your panel, and I can unmute you if you would like to ask a question that way as well. Looks like we got a question. I'm going to unmute Jeffrey Byerly. Just a moment.
Great.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, Matt, I was recently engaged in another trauma-informed care training where the topic of developmental trauma disorder came up. And I was wondering if you felt that such an identification of youth would it improve situations in our ability to support children, or would it further stigmatize?
Great question. And developmental trauma, that diagnosis to me is the next step. There was a group of people, and I include myself in this group, though I don't have the folks on the Rolodex currently that I needed to call up to really advocate and bug about this. But there was a group when the latest DSM, or basically the Bible of mental illnesses, was being written, the newest version, that really wanted to see that developmental diagnosis in there. And for me, I feel like mental health stigma exists. It's unfortunate that it exists. But if we start to assess children from that developmental perspective, I would imagine, if we just sort of did it across the board in our elementary schools, middle and high schools, we would probably see, kids with the diagnosis of personality disorder or conduct disorder or ADHD, those behaviors that got them those diagnoses are not because of some chemical imbalance that we should be labeling those diagnoses, but because of their past trauma. So I am a huge advocate for looking at trauma from that developmental perspective. Since we're under the medical model, we have to call that a mental health diagnosis. And because I'm a realist, I'm